Picture this: one tiny drop of blood, 200 medical tests, no needles, no pain, no waiting rooms. That was the promise that set Silicon Valley on fire and made Elizabeth Holmes a billionaire before she turned 30. The problem? The machine didn't work. Patients received devastating false diagnoses, and investors poured over $700 million into what would become one of the most spectacular frauds in modern history. This is the story of Theranos, how a 19-year-old Stanford dropout convinced the world's most powerful people that she'd cracked the code on blood testing, and how it all spectacularly imploded. December 2003, a teenage girl stands before her bathroom mirror, rehearsing the same pitch over and over, each time dropping her voice an octave lower. We're going to revolutionize healthcare. Pause. Clear throat. We are going to revolutionize healthcare. That girl was Elizabeth Holmes. She'd just walked away from Stanford University with a vision that would either change the world or destroy her reputation forever. Spoiler alert, it was the latter. Holmes wasn't born wearing black turtlenecks and speaking in that now infamous baritone. That persona was carefully constructed, a tech startup version of Steve Jobs, complete with the reality distortion field, but missing the actual revolutionary products. As a child, Holmes idolized Thomas Edison. She read everything about him, dreamed of following in his footsteps. At Stanford, she studied chemical engineering and approached her professor with an idea for a revolutionary drug delivery patch. He rejected it immediately, pointing out fundamental scientific flaws. Most students would have gone back to the drawing board. Holmes did something different. She dropped out entirely and decided to build her vision herself. Because apparently, if you can't pass basic chemistry requirements, the logical next step is to revolutionize all of medicine. She named her company Theranos, combining therapy and diagnosis. The pitch was intoxicating: comprehensive blood testing from a single finger prick. No more multiple vials drawn from your arm. No more waiting days for results. Instant answers. Revolutionary technology. For Silicon Valley, this was catnip. A young genius. A world-changing idea. A compelling founder with an inspiring story. There was just one tiny problem. Holmes never actually explained how the technology would work. In Silicon Valley, apparently explaining how things work is optional when you're charismatic enough. The money started flowing. But Holmes did something unexpected for a healthcare technology company. Instead of recruiting medical experts and scientists, she assembled a board that looked like a shadow government preparing for a global crisis. Former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, four-star generals like James Mattis, former senators, former cabinet members. These weren't tech people. They couldn't tell you the difference between a PCR test and a PDF file, but they understood power, influence, and geopolitics. And Holmes spoke their language fluently, not with data or clinical trial results, but with grand visions of the future delivered through compelling PowerPoint presentations. This isn't just innovation, she'd tell them, gesturing at charts that meant absolutely nothing. This is the next chapter in human health. This is how we democratize healthcare. By 2013, the mythology was complete. Forbes crowned Holmes the world's youngest self-made female billionaire with a net worth of $4.5 billion. She graced magazine covers, gave TED Talks, spoke at conferences alongside former presidents and tech titans. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The Walton family put in money. So did Oracle founder Larry Ellison and the DeVos family. In total, Theranos raised over $700 million from investors. On paper, the company was valued at $9 billion. Major pharmacy chains Walgreens and Safeway were already planning to install Theranos machines in thousands of locations nationwide. Safeway alone spent $350 million renovating stores to accommodate Theranos testing centers. And the company still hadn't launched to the general public yet. Elizabeth Holmes had pulled off something remarkable. She'd sold the world on a dream before anyone had to verify whether it actually worked. Which, spoiler alert, it absolutely did not. Step inside Theranos headquarters and you'd see everything you'd expect from a hot Silicon Valley startup. Sleek glass walls, biometric security scanners, that minimalist aesthetic that screamed, "We're changing the world," while quietly whispering, "We have no idea what we're doing." Behind all those locked doors sat the company's crown jewel, a machine they called the Edison, named after Holmes's childhood hero. This device was supposed to perform over 200 different blood tests from a single drop of blood. Revolutionary, game-changing, world-altering. Except it didn't work, not even remotely. The Edison could barely handle a dozen tests on a good day, sometimes just one. And even then, the results were wildly inconsistent. One engineer later said the most predictable thing about the machine was how unpredictably it would fail. But Theranos had painted themselves into a corner. The world already believed. Investors had written massive checks. Walgreens was preparing a nationwide rollout. Patients were waiting. So they did what any desperate company would do. They faked it. When important investors or potential partners came for demonstrations, it was pure theater. The Edison would be polished to perfection like a prop in an expensive stage production. Staff rehearsed their movements like actors. The atmosphere was carefully controlled. But here's the kicker. The results they handed over weren't from the machine everyone just watched. They were from conventional laboratory equipment hidden in the back rooms, running tests the old-fashioned way with traditional methods. Real blood. Fake demo. Everyone smiled and shook hands like they'd just witnessed a miracle instead of an elaborate magic trick. Meanwhile, the actual engineers were losing their minds. They'd spend months redesigning components, only to watch their work get quietly shelved. People started whispering in stairwells, paranoid about being overheard. One former employee said it felt like working in a surveillance state, but with better snacks and stock options. The deception went deeper than just the technology. Theranos actually ran 2 separate labs. The official one was pristine and audit-ready, perfect for fooling regulators during inspections. The real one was where the chaos lived. Bad data, failed tests, numbers that got massaged until they looked acceptable. When results came back wrong, which happened constantly, they simply reran the tests multiple times until they got something that seemed right. Lab directors who tried to raise safety concerns were told they weren't being team players, which in corporate speak translates to "you're about to get fired for having a conscience." One experienced pathologist tried to sound the alarm about serious safety issues. He was pushed out of the company. Weeks later, he died by suicide. His death haunts this story, a human cost buried under all the press coverage and investor excitement. And the patients? They were receiving results that made no sense. One woman was told twice that she was HIV positive, false alarms that turned her life completely upside down. Another received a cancer scare that was completely bogus. Phantom pregnancies, fake blood infections, hormone readings that were dangerously off. Inside Theranos, these were called anomalies. Outside, they were people's lives being derailed by faulty technology that should never have been used on actual human beings. The silence wasn't accidental. Every floor had security checkpoints. Conversations were monitored. New employees signed non-disclosure agreements thicker than medical textbooks. Ask the wrong question and you'd be told you didn't fit the culture. Departments couldn't communicate with each other by design. Engineers weren't allowed to speak with lab staff. Lab staff couldn't talk to the business side. Nobody had the complete picture except Elizabeth Holmes. And standing right beside her was Ramesh Sunny Balwani, the company's chief operating officer and Holmes' secret boyfriend, though nobody at the company knew about their relationship. Balwani had zero background in medicine or diagnostics, but he made up for it with pure intimidation. He ruled through fear, screaming in meetings, threatening lawsuits, creating an atmosphere of paranoia. His favorite line was, "If you don't believe in this company, you should leave." A lot of people did, quietly and quickly, sometimes after just a few days. The machine was failing. The labs were lying. The team was falling apart. But the public remained completely enchanted. Holmes was still being called a visionary, featured in glossy magazines, compared to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Walgreens was still preparing their nationwide launch. The house of cards was teetering, but it hadn't fallen yet. Every lie eventually meets its truth. For Theranos, that reckoning came from the inside. It started with whispered phone calls between former employees, people who'd left the company but couldn't shake what they'd witnessed. Then 2 names emerged that would blow everything wide open: Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung. Chung, working in the lab, noticed that test results were wildly inconsistent, the kind of variations that would get any legitimate lab immediately shut down. She raised concerns. Her emails were ignored. Her badge access was revoked. She left quietly, carrying the weight of what she knew. Schultz was the grandson of George Shultz, the former Secretary of State who sat on Theranos' board as one of Holmes's most prominent supporters. Tyler saw the fake demos, the manipulated data, and a company obsessed with secrecy over science. He tried to warn his grandfather. The conversation went about as well as you'd expect. George Shultz chose to believe Elizabeth Holmes over his own grandson. It would create a family rift that lasted years. When Tyler spoke up externally, Theranos went nuclear. The company launched a full-scale intimidation campaign, legal threats, surveillance, private investigators following whistleblowers around, watching their homes, potentially tapping phones. They threatened Tyler with lawsuits that would have bankrupted him, all before his 25th birthday. His family spent over $400,000 on legal fees defending him. But the truth was already in motion, in the hands of Wall Street Journal investigative reporter John Carreyrou. Carreyrou started digging. He met sources in parking garages and quiet diners, like something out of a thriller movie. He verified documents. He made calls that nobody wanted to return. He pieced together the story that Silicon Valley didn't want told. When Holmes and Balwani caught wind of the investigation, they panicked. They tried everything to kill the story before publication. Lawyers, threats, legal notices to employees they suspected of talking. They even had Rupert Murdoch, who owned both the Wall Street Journal and had invested heavily in Theranos, try to pressure the newspaper to drop the story. But Carreyrou and his editors kept pushing. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the expose that shattered the illusion. The article laid it all out. Theranos wasn't using its own technology for most tests. The Edison couldn't deliver on its promises. Results were dangerously inaccurate. Patient safety was at serious risk. The myth of Elizabeth Holmes was officially dead. Holmes went into full damage control mode. She denied everything, called the article false and misleading, claimed Carreyrou was a misogynist with an agenda against successful women in tech. She went on CNBC and said, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, then you change the world." But behind the scenes, panic was spreading like wildfire. Walgreens immediately froze their partnership and launched an internal investigation. Safeway, which had spent over $350 million preparing to integrate Theranos testing, pulled out completely. Doctors stopped trusting the results. Patients came forward with horror stories about false diagnoses that had upended their lives. Then the regulators arrived. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted a surprise inspection that revealed a complete disaster. Theranos had failed to meet even basic laboratory standards. Results were unreliable across virtually every test. Quality control was practically non-existent. The punishment was swift and devastating. Theranos was banned from operating blood testing laboratories for 2 years. Holmes was personally stripped of her license to run a lab. The company was ordered to void 2 years' worth of blood test results, essentially admitting that thousands of medical decisions had been made using completely unreliable data. Investors were furious. Doctors were livid. Patients felt betrayed. And Holmes, she doubled down, insisting the technology still worked and promising they'd fix everything. But the house was already engulfed in flames. By 2018, Elizabeth Holmes no longer controlled her own narrative. The magazine covers were gone. The TED Talks were over. The comparisons to Steve Jobs had turned into comparisons to Bernie Madoff. In their place came something much colder: formal charges from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Holmes and Balwani were accused of massive fraud, deliberately misleading investors about the company's technology, revenues, and partnerships while patients received potentially dangerous false test results. All those years of promises and billion-dollar valuations were now being called what they really were: lies. Holmes cut a deal with the SEC without admitting guilt, agreeing to step down as CEO, pay a $500,000 fine, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company. For a moment, it seemed like she might escape the worst consequences. Then the Department of Justice filed criminal charges, multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. These charges carried sentences of up to 20 years in prison each. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about freedom. The trial was delayed by the pandemic, then by Holmes's pregnancy. When it finally began in late 2021, It felt like Silicon Valley itself was on trial. Its culture of hype over substance, its blind faith in charismatic founders, its willingness to believe in magic when presented with compelling storytelling. The prosecution laid out years of systematic deception. Former employees testified about being silenced and intimidated. Investors described pitch meetings full of claims that were pure fiction. Laboratory reports showed evidence of results being edited, altered, and sometimes outright forged. Then Elizabeth Holmes took the stand, something her lawyers almost certainly wished she hadn't done. For 7 days, she tried to rewrite the narrative. She said she believed in the mission, never meant to mislead anyone, was trying to do good in the world. But then she made it deeply personal, accusing Sunny Balwani of years of psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse. She claimed he controlled every aspect of her life, including business decisions. Some saw this as a courageous revelation. Others saw it as a desperate attempt to deflect responsibility. The courtroom was riveted. The media coverage was relentless. In January 2022, after months of testimony, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients, but the damage was done. Balwani's trial followed soon after. Unlike Holmes, he didn't testify, but the evidence spoke volumes: emails, investor presentations, altered documents, testimony from former employees. He was found guilty on all 12 counts and sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison. Holmes received 11 years. By then, Theranos was long dead. The company had dissolved in 2018, its laboratories shuttered, its revolutionary machines scrapped or sitting in evidence rooms. Walgreens had quietly exited after suing for $140 million. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. And patients were left with confusion, mistrust, and in some cases, genuine trauma from false medical information. Elizabeth Holmes promised to revolutionize medicine with a single drop of blood. What she actually delivered was broken trust, shattered dreams, and one of the most audacious frauds in Silicon Valley history. The Edison machines are silent now, gathering dust as evidence or destroyed entirely. But the story lives on, not as a tale of innovation, but as a stark warning about what happens when belief replaces proof, when charisma substitutes for competence, and when the pressure to succeed overrides the obligation to tell the truth. Holmes didn't start out trying to con the world. She genuinely believed in her vision. And for a while, so did everyone else: billionaire investors, powerful politicians, respected journalists, and hopeful patients. But in the end, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And Theranos never had any. The company is gone. The dream is dead. And Elizabeth Holmes, once valued at $4.5 billion, once compared to Steve Jobs and Thomas Edison, is now serving time in federal prison for fraud. One drop of blood, one massive lie, one of the greatest cautionary tales in modern business history.